everyone, it's Alice, and today I'm gonna wrap up the books I read in November and December. Now, I had some really big plans to do some real proper reading in the final months of the year as a sort of like last-ditch effort type thing, and I read 4 books in the past 2 months, which is not exactly what I'd hoped for, so we're ending the year less spectacularly than I would have liked. But whatever, it's too late to do anything about it now, and luckily a new year is just around the corner. The first of those 4 books, though, was actually an audiobook. Now, this is the second audiobook that I've listened to this year. I struggle with audiobooks a little bit, but I am determined to get into them, so I keep trying them. And I listened to this one because I actually got the opportunity to work with an audiobook app called bookbeat, and they gave me a free trial, and I decided to try a couple of books, and I really liked this one. I do have a code with them which will work for those of you who live in Norway, and you'll find it in the description box if you're interested. But I listened to this particular audiobook because I asked one of my friends for audiobook recommendations because she listens to some of them, and she said that these were some of her favorites, and it's an author I've been wanting to try, so I decided to try it out. It's a Norwegian book called Helvete by Oslo, which translates to hell. And it's pretty short, so you might even call it a novella, but it's about this newly divorced woman who moves into a new house, and as she's doing some gardening, she finds a stairway in her backyard, which happens to lead to hell, which in this book is kind of like an amusement park. Now, this might be one of the more absurd books that I've ever encountered, and I've read some weird books in my time, but this just, I don't know what I was expecting, but I got something very special and quite interesting. And obviously the concept of hell as like an amusement park or a destination that you can visit as a tourist is funny, but also absurd and a little bizarre. Like I mentioned, I've never read any of this author's work, but I have heard a lot about him, and especially about his writing, which is quite particular. And now that I've read it, I get it. It is a little bit like, it has a certain style to it that really worked for me. It goes on tangents all of the time, which sometimes doesn't work, but in this it does, because whatever tangent it goes on, it does add something to the story. Either it's to the characters or to the setting, or just because it's funny. And there is something about the writing that adds like a lighter tone to it, which is an interesting contrast to the setting of hell. The audiobook that I listened to was actually a live recording, which I was a little bit like, I started it and I thought, I don't know how I feel about this, but it actually worked really well. And it's read by the author, which I think adds like an extra layer to it, and it flows really well. And it was almost, because there is a live audience as well, you can sometimes hear like laughter, and it just felt more podcasty than a lot of other audiobooks that I've listened to. Sometimes I think the thing that throws me off with audiobooks is that sometimes the reading is just too, like, it's not how people actually talk, and listening to this was exactly like having someone read it to you in real time, which is what that recording is, because it's a live recording. But that kind of recording worked really well. It took like maybe 10 minutes to get used to, but once I was into it, it was great. I will say, I do think this is one of those books that I don't know if it would work in translation. I looked it up, and I think it's been translated to a couple of other languages. It's not available in English, but because of how it's written and because of how it like plays on sort of Norwegian stereotypes as to how we are as people, but a lot of those stereotypes are true, there's a lot about that that makes it funny. And I don't know if it would work in, let's say, English. Like, I think it's very particular, and I don't know if it would really work in translation like at all. All of that being said, though, the actual story, it is amusing and creative and enjoyable, but to me it wasn't very impactful. Like, it's a fun concept, but it's a little simple in the end, I think. And I really enjoyed it when I was listening to it. It was very entertaining, but I don't know if it really made any sort of lasting impression on me. The only thing that I think I'm gonna remember about this is like the tone and the writing. That's a good thing though, because I want to read more of this author's work, and I figured that out by reading this book, and it was quite short, so it might have been like a good way into this author, but I don't know if this is gonna stick with me in any sort of important way. So I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. Really glad I listened to it. I feel like this is an author, like if you're Norwegian, this is an author that's good to listen to in audiobook form because of the way that he reads it and because of the tone, but I'm sure it would be great to read like in physical form as well. Secondly, we have this tome, which has been everywhere these past couple of months. It's Babel by R.F. Kuang, and this is a historical fiction fantasy novel that starts off in 1828 when this Chinese boy is brought over from China to England by this mysterious professor, and he is brought there to study translation, and he ends up at this university in Oxford where they use language in a kind of magic and they use translation in magic. But our main character soon learns that they use this magic to further the British Empire by they basically use magic to suppress other countries, including the one that he comes from. I have a lot of thoughts about this book, and I'm gonna try to summarize as best I can, because this book took me on a ride. So you may have heard this book referred to as like a dark academia book, which I feel like is pretty accurate. Like, I love the historical setting, I love the setting of Oxford, and there is a lot of academia in it, and I loved all of that. And I really, like, when I started this book, I was immediately invested and I was sucked into it very quickly. I feel like a thing a lot of people say about this book is that it feels very well researched, and I agree with that, and I really appreciate that. You can tell that the author knows a lot about and is passionate about translations in particular. There's a lot of other stuff in here as well that she appears to know a lot about, but especially with the translations, there's a lot about it in here, and you can tell that the author really cares about it and knows a lot about it, which I really like. There are also footnotes in the book that refer to a lot of translation stuff and like historical stuff, and this is one of those things that is like maybe a weird thing, but I love footnotes in fiction novels, and it's pretty rare that you find them. So I really enjoyed that, and then I very much enjoyed our characters, especially our main character, and following him throughout the story and seeing where they all ended up. There is also a magic system in here, which I thought was really cool and interesting, even if I didn't fully understand it. And I can't quite tell if it's just me who didn't understand it, or if I didn't fully understand it because it isn't fully explained. I don't quite know, but there were some parts about that I sort of wondered about a little bit, but I think it's a very cool concept, and I love the sort of mix of language, translation, and magic. Now, when I was reading this, I'd say for like the first half, maybe a little bit more, I was super invested in this, and I was like excited to pick it back up, and it was moving slowly, but I really liked it. Like, we slowly get to learn about all of this magic and the history and like all of these people, and I really enjoyed that it was moving quite slowly. And I remember, I think I mentioned in a video that I liked that the book was big and that it was going to have a lot of details in it. And for the first half, I really felt that, and I was super invested. Then I got to the second half, and it just started to drag a little bit for me. I felt like at that point, things should have started to pick up, and it did a little bit, but it didn't move fast enough, and we still had like hundreds and hundreds of pages of slow moving stuff, and I felt like it started getting a little bit repetitive. It does repeat itself a little bit, and I just felt like it just dragged a little bit, and I spent maybe 4 times as long on the last half than I did on the first half, and it's just because I got a little bit bored. It does really pick up at the end again, and I really liked the ending and I was invested in that, but it took me a while to get there. It's been a couple of weeks since I finished this book, and I have thought quite a lot about it since I finished it, which I guess is a good sign, and I've worked something out that is the reason that this isn't like a new favorite book for me. I love the themes in this book and the discussions that it has, and I love that there's like a dark academia book discussing these kinds of things, because I think it's really important and I love it, and I hope that more people write books like these. But it does a thing that I don't like, which is that it over-explains. It very, very much over-explains what the story is trying to say. And I think that more of that could have been trusted to the reader to sort of figure out for themselves. I think that would have made more of an impact. And I noticed in the writing, and it started to bother me more towards the end, is that you know that thing of like show, don't tell? This book does a lot of telling and not showing, but then it also does telling and showing. So it first shows you something and then it explains to you what that is supposed to mean. And I just think less of that would have been better, and I think there should have been more trust in the reader to figure it out, because I think most people would be able to figure it out. There are a couple of other things in here as well, like I think some of the characters could have used a little bit more work, like some of the side characters. But overall, like, don't get me wrong, I think this is a really good book and I really enjoyed reading it. I love the dark academia vibes, so if you're into that kind of thing, I think you'd really enjoy this. I also love the setting, and there's a lot of cool stuff in this book, and I love the language, translation, like the magic. It's a very cool idea and it's executed fairly well. When I finished this book, I was like somewhere in between 3 and 4 stars, and I was leaning towards 4, but now that it's been a while, I'm gonna give it a 3. It is a strong 3, and 3 for me is not a bad rating at all. It's a really good rating. It's like I read and enjoyed it, but there's too much that I didn't love about it to sort of give it 4 stars. But I'm really glad I read this, and I love these kinds of books, and I just wish that there were more of them, because I love dark academia books. And if you like these kinds of books, if you like historical fiction fantasy, I would say it's worth the read. And I really hope this author writes more books, because I want to read them. Moving on, I actually read a Christmassy book, which now Christmas is over and no one cares, so I'm gonna review this very quickly. It was Stargate by Ingvild H. Risøy, and this is a story about 2 sisters who live in a home with a father who keeps losing his job because he's an alcoholic, and it's about their time leading up to Christmas. I should have maybe realized that this was going to be as sad as it was, because I have heard a lot of people say that it's a very sad book, but it took me a little bit by surprise. It's a short book, but it's impactful, and it's a very quick read because a lot of the pages like don't have full text on it, so it is quite short to read as well. But now that I have read it, I do understand why a lot of people say you have to read this book. The story is set in this particular part of Oslo that I'm actually very familiar with, so immediately when I started this book, I felt like the setting was there for me, and I feel like the characters are done really well. Even though it's a short book, the characters immediately feel familiar, but I mean that in a really good way. Like, immediately you just feel like, of course they're real people, and of course, you know, this is how they feel and how they think, and it was quite impactful, like all of it. And I like that the book doesn't have any more to it than it needs. The only thing that I feel slightly ambivalent about is the ending. This book has a very open ending, and it's an ending that is very clearly up for interpretation, and I just sometimes struggle with those kinds of endings. Like, I got this book from one of my friends, and when I finished the book, I immediately texted her, and I'm like, what the hell does that mean? And she was like, I guess you can just interpret it. And because I am the way I am, immediately I thought of the saddest ending possible, like the saddest and most horrible way you can interpret the ending. And so I don't know quite how I feel about that, but overall, really, really like this. If you want to read a sad story for Christmas, this is the one that you should read, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Lastly, I finally got around to reading The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden, and this is the third and final book in the Winter Night trilogy, where we follow a girl in historical Russia who can see things that others can't and do things that others can't, and she's basically a witch. Seeing as this is the third book and I don't want to give anything away as to what happens in it, I'm gonna try to keep it short. I thought this was a very good ending to the trilogy, and I feel like it wrapped up a lot of the things that have been happening in the other books pretty well. There is just something to this story that just appeals to me so much. Like, I just love the world, and I love following our main character, and I love all of the magic and like folk tale and religious stuff, and this, like, all of these books give me like a very particular feeling that I don't know how to explain, but it's like one of the best feelings in the world. This is a little bit different than the other two books, and I've read some reviews for this after I finished it, and I feel like I saw that a lot of people felt that this book was different, and some people felt that they didn't mean that in a good way, and I understand what they mean. I think that the last half of this book is the part of the book that's like remarkably different, and I think it's because there are two major like battles in the final part of this book, and it sort of wraps up, like it's the result of what has happened in the other two books. And there's like two conflicts going on, if you will, and I'll be honest, I only really cared about one of them. One of them is like magical and the other is political, and I, throughout the other books as well, didn't really care about all of the politics stuff. I was much more into the magic, and I understand why that part loses people a little bit, and it did also lose me a little bit. I think it felt a little bit messy, like parts of it. There are also some parts of the story where I read it and I was like, that's a little bit convenient. But then there are also like other things that I felt were done better than in the previous books. Specifically, a lot of the emotional aspect I felt like were done really, really well in this. I do think that the other two books are probably a little bit stronger, but I'm still gonna give this the same rating that I gave the other two books, which is 4 stars, even though those are like a little bit above this one. I just feel like 3 stars is too low for this book, and I've just really, really enjoyed this trilogy. I love this magical world, and I'm a little sad that it's over, I'm not gonna lie, but I also think that maybe next winter I'll like read all of them in one go, and that could be really fun. And these are definitely books that I'm going to keep and read throughout the rest of my life because I just love this world so much. Okay, everyone. Those were all the books that I had to talk about today, and that wraps up my last wrap-up of 2022. I'm really looking forward to the new year. I always feel like January makes me want to read even more because it's like a new year and I would like to start it strong, so I'm hoping that my reading is going to be better next year. I'd love to know what you all have been reading for the past couple of months, and as always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. I will see you next year.